Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Drexel InterView. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, speaking to you from the Peck Alumni Center at Drexel University. This is one of 3 episodes dedicated to the celebration of the 125th anniversary of Drexel. Each episode will be devoted to a term referred to in the university's original name, the Drexel Institute of Art, Science, and Industry. The current episode is devoted to industry, and we're pleased to have as our guests former Philadelphia Mayor and Pennsylvania Governor Edward G. Rendell and Drexel University political science professor Richardson Dilworth. Governor Rendell helped to reform and vitalize both the city and state during his periods in office. Dr. Dilworth is director of the Center for Public Policy at Drexel. He is the namesake of his grandfather, Richardson Dilworth, who was mayor of Philadelphia from 1956 to 1962. Ed Rendell, Richardson Dilworth, welcome to the Drexel InterView.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
So Governor Rendell, to start with you, you began your political career in 1977 as district attorney, and I wonder what the city was like then and how it compared with some 15 years later when you ran for mayor in 1991.
The city in 1977 was undergoing changes, as almost all American cities were. They were turning from industrial bases. Dr. Dilworth and I were talking off camera about how little hard industry there still is in a town that used to be an industrial powerhouse. But we were transforming from hard industry to more of a service center, financial center, insurance center, banking center, et cetera. The city's economy was in fairly good shape, and the city government was running a slight surplus. Now that surplus was sort of illusory because some of the contracts that had been given out to the city workforce absolutely preordained that we'd have trouble down the road. And we did, and 15 years later, by the time I became mayor, the city was facing the most significant deficit in terms of percentage of revenue of any American city in history, even a greater deficit in percentage of revenue than Detroit is currently facing.
So that is, you saw the beginnings of it as DA, and then when you went into office, it was in full bloom. And I want to get back obviously to your time of being mayor, but going back further in time to when Richardson's grandfather was in office. Were those seeds there then as well, the deindustrialization and the beginning of the flight to suburbia of the middle class? Now this would be in the 1950s and early 60s. What was the city like at that time?
Well, I wasn't alive, but certainly, I mean, by 1956, the city had reached the apex of its population. At some point between 1950 and 1960, we know that it started to lose population. I don't know of the extent that it was potentially losing industry, visibly losing industry after World War II. But certainly every urban history is aware of the fact that that's when the initial sort of move for downtown renewal began, in large part, I think, at least marketed as a means for central cities and downtowns to remain competitive to what they saw as an increasing suburban presence. Obviously, you had the other factors. You had the baby boom. You had at that point still arguably, I think, racially discriminatory federally guaranteed mortgages that were subsidizing suburban construction out of the center cities. Obviously, you had the beginnings of the interstate system that made that the commute out possible, beginning in the central cities, as it was primarily funded through the federal highway tax, so it needed to fund itself initially through the heaviest traffic areas within the country. You had a lot of federal money coming into cities and a lot of new federal money coming into cities, and I think possibly, and I'd be interested to know your opinion about this, but one distinction, I think, between the sort of reform movement mayors, in which certainly Joseph Clark and my grandfather were kind of the top billing reformers in Philadelphia, and I think the sort of 1990 era's reform mayors, of which certainly You were one of the key mayors at that point, but also I'd say Giuliani and Stephen Goldsmith were certainly, I'd say, sort of equivalents, though Republicans. But one thing is, in the 1950s, you had new federal housing money, you had the interstate money, you had redevelopment funds, you had all of this federal money coming into the cities. And to a great extent, I think the reform era mayors of the 1950s, and I would include Lee and New Haven as well. And New Haven per capita was the biggest recipient of federal redevelopment money of any big city. That in the 1990s, I think it's a very different picture in terms of the relationship between cities and the federal government.
So what happened then? So you had this surge of reform in the 50s, and then you had the falling off, and the cities really began to go downhill. And then you came in as mayor in the early 90s.
It's actually a frightening image to think about, because there's no question that Joe Clark and Richardson Dilworth did a tremendous job in revitalizing the city and putting a lot of emphasis on downtown, and got great credit for that and high marks, which they richly deserved. But then Richardson Dilworth left in 1962. I became mayor in 1992. 30 years later, the city had totally crapped out. It was unbelievable that from the halcyon days of the Clark-Dilworth restoration or revitalization, we could have relatively quickly, 30 years isn't all that quick, but things could have gone bad so quickly.
But every major city in the country underwent that sort of decline.
Because of the fall off of federal funds, although, truth be told, the single best federal program there's ever been for cities was the Community Development Block Grant Program, initiated by, not a Democrat, by Richard Nixon. There were reasons for it, the deindustrialization, the fall off of federal funds. But one of the things that we were so successful at, in addition to our own initiatives and the Avenue of the Arts and all of the programs that we started, we also had Bill Clinton as president. I was very fortunate that 1 year after I became mayor, Bill Clinton became president, and all of a sudden the tide started changing in terms of federal help for the cities. We got an enormous amount of federal help for our housing authority, and the incredible 360-degree change in our public housing projects and developments that you saw was fueled by the money that came in during the Clinton, Cisneros administration. We got incredible revitalization and job training money to make up for the closure of the shipyards. And also the economy was great.
Yeah.
I was also fortunate not only that Bill Clinton was president, and that was a different federal attitude, but I had 7 years of the Clinton economy, which produced 24 million new jobs. Cities, more than any political subdivision in the country, particularly large cities that are media centers, cities can be driven almost by force of personality by the mayor. You can, by force of personality, change things because you dominate the media market. You're everywhere. People see you everywhere. You're on TV all the time. You're on the talk shows. You call into sports shows. The city becomes your personality. And when you look at the great turnarounds, Clark and Dilworth, both strong, strong personalities. I mean, your granddad probably was the most charismatic municipal leader, clearly of his time, and you can do that. And you look at Schaefer in Baltimore, and the two Dailies in Chicago. They were strong, strong, strong leaders. There's no question about it. Giuliani in New York, Koch in New York, Kevin White in Boston. They were all strong leaders. Joe Riley in Charleston. Joe Riley's been mayor of Charleston for almost 3 decades. They've been very, very fortunate. So strong mayors can do things by force of personalities, and you can win battles because you can use the fact that you dominate the media market to get your message across. So the reason we were successful in getting a contract, which was a great contract for the city, over $200 million in savings, work rule changes, benefit reductions, things like that, and a good contract for city workers because we dealt with that largest deficit in history and not one city worker lost their job. Mm-hmm. So even though the unions hated it, And when I ran for re-election, interestingly, I was the first Democrat in a half a century to lose the endorsement of all 4 municipal unions. They endorsed my Republican opponent.
Yeah.
I got 81% of the vote and carried every precinct.
Well, I guess I would ask you, Richard, the whole issue of the unions strikes me as so interesting from an urban point of view, and what you think as a political scientist, and I guess also the historian, about this issue of balancing workers' rights and private economic prosperity and so forth. Is this an abiding issue, or do you think it is, were there certain moments in time where it became particularly vexed, the union and the balancing of the union, especially as a Democrat, union rights and the prosperity and getting things done in the city?
So there are sort of 2 questions there.
Sure, there are more than 2.
I'll answer the first, but I think about unions, and I'd say I would of course be interested in your opinion, but I think the reason that you faced the kind of fight that you did with the unions was because the city was the city had, through the 1970s and 1980s, sort of been the most stable, other than probably universities, the most stable job sector within the city. So in some respects, it's just that they were taking up a larger portion of government revenue because they were kind of the only ones left. Had you had a city that was growing like Philadelphia was growing in the 1910s, the 1920s, when I think the model for that kind of unionized municipal employee was beginning to be set by civil service rules and stuff like that, you wouldn't have had a problem. But the problem is that between 1950 and today, Philadelphia lost 25% of its population. The commensurate decline in terms of city employees takes the kind of tough contract negotiations that I think you had to push. Granted, you said that nobody lost their jobs, but I think part of it is that they were being provided a kind of attractive benefit pool that kept people in the city.
Oh, no question. And it's a very good point. I mean, one of the ways I was able to get the public on our side is I would compare the benefits that our workers got to the benefits that private sector workers got. It's interesting. I think our new mayor, who I have high hopes for, because he's creative, he's passionate, he's visionary, he's not afraid to break the mold on things. But I think he was elected in part because of strong union support. And there comes a time, I mean, you're the employer. You can be nice, you can be friendly, but you're the employer, but you're also the steward of 1.5 million taxpayers' money.
Yeah.
So you've got to have an arm's length relationship with the unions. I mean, you show me a mayor who is beloved by the municipal unions, I will show you a city that's in trouble.
That's in trouble. That's a good line.
Well, perfect example.
Well, let's switch to your governorship. We only have so much time, and I really want to get into the difference that you felt between leading a state versus leading a city. As you said, you already said a bit about this when you said that you could be present in a city in a way I guess you can't be present. But the constituencies are so different when you're a governor. How did you manage that? And when you're thinking back, what do you feel were the strengths and weaknesses of your period as governor?
Well, it's interesting. The reverse of what I said is true. Pennsylvania had 6 distinct media markets. There's no way you can dominate the media markets. There's no way you can be on TV every night delivering your message. It's very, very difficult to use force of personality to change things and bring about change. That's number one. Number two, there's sometimes those 6 separate distinct areas of the state, and they're as different. I mean, you look at the northern tier. The northern tier has more in common with Montana and Wyoming than it does with Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. So they're different places, and they have different interests and different needs. And it's like you're balancing a limited pool of resources. You're a parent balancing a limited pool of resources with 6 totally different children who need totally different attention. And sometimes what's good for one is not necessarily good for the other. So it's a balancing test. And what you try to do is be as fair as you can in how you distribute the limited pool of resources. You try to find things that are good for everyone, and there are things One of the things is when you're battling, for example, for a clean environment, you're benefiting people in the Southeast who want better air for their children, and you're up against, you know, the coal interest, the coal burning interest. But guess who's on your side? Trout Unlimited, because the bad air not only gives asthma to kids, it can kill fish. They'll fall out. So sometimes there are things that there's a commonality of interest about, but we used to keep a scorecard. My head of policy and planning, Donna Cooper, we kept a scorecard of every dime that we gave in everything we did: economic development, transportation, arts and culture, environmental control, everything we did, county by county. So I made sure that I didn't favor the urban counties, and that unlike most of the fear that the voters had that I would favor Philadelphia, we actually gave in my 8 years more money to Allegheny County than we did to Philadelphia. So you have to balance those interests. But it's a harder job. It's not as much fun. You're not the first responder. You're the last one in. You're the person who they call on when all else is lost. You don't get to sort of roll up your sleeves and dig into a problem. But the good news is, to balance that off, is unlike mayor, you have resources, and you have the ability to generate resources. So I could do more for education in Philadelphia as governor than I could as mayor, because the mayor has limited resources to put into the educational pot. And of course, as I was doing it for Philadelphia, it helped every one of the 501 school districts in Pennsylvania.
How would you compare working with the city council versus working with the General Assembly?
Well, it's an interesting question. City council has been for the longest time 14 Democrats and 3 Republicans. So there's no political split. In Harrisburg, the split is both partisan, Democrat and Republican, but even more than political, it's ideological. It's ideological. And you don't have any of that as mayor to deal with. You just have to make sure you nurture the personalities and you keep everybody involved, and you share credit and things like that, things that are basic common sense.
Let me piggyback on that, the ideological split as governor that you experienced, which now has become so pervasive, not just obviously in the state, but in the country on a level that is mind-blowing. And I wonder, as a political person, I guess my question is, what do you make of it? What would you do about it if you were in a position to do something? Where will this end? And I guess I'll ask both of you this question based on your knowledge.
You take the first shot at that. Yeah.
The acrimonious nature of politics right now.
I don't have pleasant thoughts on the subject.
It's hard.
I think, so if we look at the current Republican primary, one thing that strikes me is when you look at Donald Trump, everyone wants to compare Donald Trump to either Pat Buchanan or George Wallace. But I think the appropriate comparison to Donald Trump, which I think gets to your question, is actually William Jennings Bryan. And I think that because the economic inequality that you see today parallels the economic inequality that you see in the 1890s, more so than the 1960s or anything in the 20th century. And the same thing with the partisan split. In terms of trying to measure a partisan division within Congress, especially across time, the best data is this stuff called Poole and Rosenthal data. And in terms of an ideologically split, to the extent that you can measure something like that across a century, the greatest parallel in terms of an ideological divide in Congress is an ideological divide that was in Congress in the 19th century, in the late 19th century. So when William Jennings Bryan is trying to get the Democratic nomination in 1896, and he succeeds at a time when nominating conventions really were nominating conventions, and he splits apart the Democratic Party into the Western populists and the Eastern industrialists, that really strikes me as what Donald Trump and the Donald Trump candidacy is really sort of doing to the Republican Party in a lot of the same respects. Not obviously the same thing, but of course, I mean, you've got the problem of the sort of plutocratic populist that Jennings Bryan really wasn't. And certainly Sanders is kind of the Democratic echo at a much sort of minor rate.
Okay, I mean, that's a great historical analogy, but now I'm wondering, going to the governor here, the idea of personality here. Do you feel it would be possible to have someone's personality be powerful enough to bridge this divide and this particular juncture in history? I know you're a great Hillary supporter, so I don't know whether this is an entree for that.
Well, I actually think there are two people running for president who have the personality to maybe bridge the divide. Not on everything, but on certain things. And to make Congress understand that you can't, as the great Rolling Stones song says, you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you just might find you get what you need. And I think that's Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. I think Bernie, and I love Bernie Sanders' passion, and he's a wonderful man, but Bernie would there'd be a ideological Armageddon if he became president. But I think Hillary has the ability, and believe it or not, on the Republican side, the much maligned Jeb Bush. And the reason I say that is my first 2 years as governor were Jeb Bush's last 2 years as governor, and we worked together in the National Governors Association. And Jeb Bush was an incredibly strong force for working together and sending a common message from states to Washington, a common message that Democrats and Republicans could agree on. And he convinced us on many occasions to coalesce behind an idea that was somewhere in the center between our two ideological bents. And he was a great compromiser, which I think is not a dirty word.
He doesn't seem to have a forceful personality,
but
at least as it's been highlighted in the current debate.
The interesting thing is there's a different personality for governing as there is for campaigning. Once in a while, you get someone like Bill Clinton who had them both. Had a great personality for campaigning and had a great personality for getting along with the Congress. I mean, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich did some amazing things together. They couldn't have been more ideologically different, and yet they did. Personalities dominated that. And I like President Obama. I think he's done some very good things. But I think the ball is always in the executive's court. The executive is the one who has to go to the legislature, often his own party or her own party, and say, look, we can do this. We can do this. And I know what you need, and we're going to give you what you need. But we've all got to give up a little. The frustrating thing about what's going on in Pennsylvania right now, and Governor Wolf is trying his best, is that there doesn't seem to be anything that will satisfy some of the Republicans in the House. And that's true, I guess, nationally. There seems to be very little that will satisfy the Tea Party. They don't want government. They don't want government at all. So it's very difficult to negotiate any sort of a compromise with people with that attitude.
Well, we're almost out of time, so I would like to ask you a final question, which I know that you, and I don't know about Richard, are a great sports fan. And there was recently an article in the New York Times saying that it's sad that Philadelphia has the sad sack sports teams on the one hand, and yet it's such a successful city on the other. Right now, it seems to be doing so well. It's sort of a sixth borough of New York City. I don't know if we like that so much, but that's how we're being described. So this relationship between the sports and the rest, is this just happenstance, or do you think what is it with sports in Philly, and is it important?
In what the city does and the face that it presents to the businesses, to tourists, et cetera, sports isn't so important. I mean, it's important to have major league sports. Businesses want to locate into towns that have great orchestras and great operas, but also have all four major league sports, so that's important. The sports are important to the people of the city because this is a hard-working town. It's still a town where most of the workers are blue-collar workers, and they love sports, and sports gives them their identity. There was a great scene in, not Silver Lining Playbook, in the story about Vince Papale, Invincible, the movie Invincible, when Vince Papale tells a story about how his dad told him that it was only the success of the Eagles or the fact that they were playing on Sunday that got him through the week in the hard factory that he worked in. It was only the Eagles that got him through the week.
And that's a motif in that book, The Silver Linings Playbook, too.
As well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But I think it's just a temporary moment in time. I don't know if you have thoughts. Are you a sports person? I mean, I love the fact that you have been engaged with this throughout your time as mayor and governor.
I was here during I was mayor and governor during the successful period for the Eagles when we were in championship games all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't seem to have hurt Austin.
No.
They, but I think, when Richard Florida wrote that book, The Rise of the Creative Class, he was sort of his big thing, saying sports teams don't matter. And he points to Austin as the successful city. But I would not want to be the mayor if a professional sports team left.
Oh, yeah.
That would just,
There's so much range.
And Doctor, I would always say when I was mayor, I said, if the Eagles win a playoff game, before the next round, the next Sunday, I could raise the wage tax in between, and nobody would notice. Nobody would notice.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to have to end. I think we could go on much longer, but you've been delightful guests. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
thank you.
And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel Interview.